On the morning of April 8, 1943, high above occupied France, the frozen air at 27,000 feet hissed past the canopy of a Focke-Wulf 190A5. Inside, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermiken's oxygen mask couldn't quite conceal the amused curl of his mouth. Through the glass, in the flawless visibility, he watched the unfamiliar shapes heaving their way upward toward his formation. As an experienced ace of Jagdgeschwader 26, only 26 years old and already hardened by years of war, he studied these brand-new American fighters making their first serious appearance over Europe. "The Americans sent us milk cans with wings," he joked over the radio to his wingman, laughter coloring his voice as he watched the big Republic P-47 Thunderbolts slog toward altitude. Below, 16 P-47C Thunderbolts from the 4th Fighter Group were climbing in tight formation, their two 0-horsepower Pratt and Whitney R2000 800 double Wasp engines hauling almost 7 tons of mass through the thinning air. To German eyes accustomed to the sleek forms of Bf-109s or the compact aggression of Spitfires, these wide-bodied American machines looked almost ridiculous. Their fuselages were thick and barrel-like, capped with greenhouse-style canopies, with wings that seemed undersized for such bulk and propellers so large they made everything in the Luftwaffe's inventory seem dainty. What Hermiken couldn't possibly know, and what none of the German pilots circling confidently above suspected, was that they were watching the arrival of the aircraft that would methodically wreck the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Within a year and a half, these flying milk bottles would change from a running joke to a symbol of dread. The sound of 850 caliber Browning machine guns spitting fire from their wings would become the last noise many German pilots ever heard. The cold arithmetic of destruction already lived in those broad wings. 400 rounds of ammunition, a collective rate of fire around 60 rounds a minute, sufficient to cut a Messerschmitt in two in under 2 seconds if it strayed into that lethal cone. The shift in perception began that same April day when Major Donald Blakesley, commander of the 335th Fighter Squadron, caught sight of a German formation preparing to attack. Blakesley, who had flown with the RAF's Eagle squadrons and had only just moved from Spitfires to P-47s, understood something crucial his men had not learned yet. Surviving in the Thunderbolt meant throwing out everything they thought they knew about dogfighting. The P-47 was not just a larger version of existing fighters. It was a break with the prevailing philosophy. While German designers focused on light interceptors optimized to climb quickly and turn hard, Republic Aviation produced something entirely different, a high-altitude battering ram that used weight, horsepower, and raw firepower to rewrite the rulebook of aerial combat. Mixed among the 56 American pilots scattered across northern France that morning were young men who would later become legends, aces whose names would be whispered in German dispersal huts. But on April 8, 1943, they were green pilots in an unproven aircraft, facing the most battle-hardened fighter force on the planet. The Luftwaffe had been at war since 1939. Its ranks included veterans of Poland, France, the Battle of Britain, and the steppes of Russia. The U.S. Army Air Forces on that front had precisely 0 days of air combat experience. This is the story of how industrial logic crushed tactical brilliance, how quantity merged with high quality to form irresistible superiority, and how mocking laughter in German cockpits turned into fear when pilots learned what 8 closely harmonized Browning guns could do at 400 yards. The Thunderbolt's roots lay in the crisis of June 1940. As German aircraft rampaged across France, Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born chief designer at Republic Aviation, received an urgent specification from the U.S. Army Air Corps. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor that could meet or beat the Luftwaffe's best fighters. Kartveli did not simply scale up existing designs. He delivered something massive and unprecedented, a machine that pushed the boundaries of what a single-engine fighter could be. "It will be like a dinosaur," he reportedly told his team. but a dinosaur with good proportions. When the XP-47B prototype took to the air on May 6, 1941, it stunned observers. Empty, it weighed about 900 pounds, roughly 65% heavier than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. The enormous turbo supercharger system, with long ducting running through the fuselage behind the cockpit, made the aircraft look almost swollen, giving rise to cracks about its pregnant appearance. Test pilots, approaching it for the first time, often joked, "You're sure this thing flies?" It did more than fly. It did things no other fighter could touch at altitude. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial putting out 20 horsepower, could hold that power up around 27 feet, where German engines were already gasping. The exhaust-driven turbo supercharger gave the engine almost sea-level performance in the stratosphere, far above the zone where most mechanical superchargers lost their punch. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group during its early training at Bridgeport, Connecticut, initially despised the big fighter. Between September 1942 and January 1943, his outfit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training mishaps alone. For a time, the Thunderbolt killed more Americans in preparation than Germans managed in combat. It was unforgiving on the ground, prone to ground looping on landing. On takeoff, torque could roll the plane over if mishandled. In a steep dive, it plunged so fast that pilots ran into a then little understood phenomenon: compressibility, where shock waves formed over the wings and locked the controls. Yet the ones who learned to tame it discovered its hidden brilliance. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, an Oklahoma farm boy who would end the war with 27 victories to his name, described his first flight in the P-47 as akin to strapping himself to a runaway train. "The power felt limitless. You didn't so much fly it," he said later, as pointed. The first clashes with German fighters in April and May 1943 seemed to confirm every sneer uttered in Luftwaffe mess halls. P-47s could not hope to outturn the Focke-Wulf 190, nor could they outclimb Bf-109s at low or medium altitudes, and they felt clumsy compared to the nimble German machines. Luftwaffe tacticians quickly exploited these weaknesses. They attacked from beneath, where the heavy P-47 struggled to respond, and tried to drag Thunderbolts into turning fights where nimbleness trumped sheer firepower. Hauptmann Josef "Pips" Priller, commander of Jagdschwader 26, sent in an early assessment after one such encounter. "The new American fighter is fit only for butchering," he wrote. "It handles like a lorry, corners like a freight train, and climbs like a cow with child. Our boys call them fat Indians, targets pretending to be warriors." The statistics from the first month hardly contradicted him. American Thunderbolt units lost 14 aircraft in exchange for only 3 confirmed German fighters. RAF pilots sharing the skies in Spitfires quietly suggested to their American allies that perhaps another fighter might be wiser. British airmen joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to stand up in the roomy cockpit and run around in circles. But beneath these early impressions, a slower story was unfolding. One German intelligence officers failed to fully grasp. The Thunderbolts that were lost often went down only after absorbing astonishing damage. One aircraft limped home from a mission on May 4th with 21 cannon hits and more than 100 machine gun strikes. A Spitfire or Messerschmitt would have been confetti long before. The big radial engine with no vulnerable coolant system shrugged off hits that would instantly cripple liquid-cooled fighters. Just as important, when P-47s did get a firing solution, the result was often immediate and catastrophic. The Thunderbolt's arsenal wasn't merely powerful. It created a dense, focused volume of fire that Luftwaffe pilots had never faced before. While early warfighters carried rifle-caliber guns or cannons with limited ammunition, the P-47 could sustain fire for half a minute or more, an endless torrent by the standards of air combat. The episode that truly began to overturn German assumptions took place on June 26, 1943, above Lille, France. The central figure was Second Lieutenant Robert S. Rao Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron, whose ordeal quickly became one of the classic air combat stories of the war. Johnson's group of 48 P-47s was returning from escort duty when 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from 2JG-26, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz-Galland, pounced from the sun. The Germans had perfect positioning and a big speed advantage. Johnson, flying near the back of the formation, found himself the focus of multiple attackers, and was nearly shredded in the first few seconds. Roughly 21 20mm shells struck his Thunderbolt. The canopy exploded, hydraulic fluids sprayed across the cockpit, the engine cowling ripped open, and fire started behind the instruments. Johnson, bleeding from shrapnel in his nose and leg, tried to bail out, but the canopy wouldn't slide back. A shell had detonated in the track, jamming it solid. Trapped in a mangled airplane at high altitude, he had only one option: try to fly it. What followed overturned every belief about how much punishment a fighter could endure. With his windscreen smeared in oil, the engine shaking violently and barely running, and sluggish, half-responsive controls, Johnson somehow managed to stabilize the airplane and point it toward England. The Thunderbolt, burning and mauled, stubbornly stayed in the air. Then another threat appeared. A lone Focke-Wulf 190 from 2JG-26 spotted the wounded American fighter crawling toward the channel at less than 170 miles per hour. Whoever the German pilot was, and historians still debate his identity, he did what any fighter pilot would do. He slipped in behind the damaged P-47 and fired with his 420 mm cannons and two 13 mm machine guns at that. Johnson, unable to maneuver, crouched behind his armor plate and waited for death. The Thunderbolt swallowed the Germans' entire cannon armament. The 190 broke off, repositioned, and raked Johnson's airplane again, now with his remaining machine gun ammunition. With his heavy guns empty, the German eased up beside the crippled P-47 and stared in visible disbelief. Johnson could clearly see the man's face. Young, blond, his expression evolving from smug certainty to confusion, then to something like anxiety. He dropped back once more and fired his last machine gun rounds into the wrecked Thunderbolt. Still, it refused to fall. Finally, the German pulled up alongside again, shook his head slowly as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing, raised his hand in a casual salute, and turned away, out of ammunition and out of options. Johnson crash-landed at Manston when his engine finally quit on the runway. Ground crews counted bullet and shell holes until they passed 200 and gave up. A cannon round had burst inches from his head. Another had slammed into the armor behind his seat. The engine carried multiple direct hits. Control cables were frayed and partially severed. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural backbone of the fuselage, were shot clean through. Yet the airplane had still brought him back. Johnson's survival shocked engineers and commanders on both sides. American technicians poring over the wreckage realized they had underestimated the toughness of their own creation. German intelligence officers initially refused to accept 2JG-26 reports. No fighter should remain controllable after that kind of abuse. But testimony from multiple pilots and the physical evidence forced them to accept the uncomfortable reality. A P-47 had absorbed the full fury of a first-rate German fighter and lived. By July 1943, American pilots were beginning to unlock the Thunderbolt's true potential. Lieutenant Colonel Zemke, now leading the 56th Fighter Group in combat, had learned the hard way what not to do. His instructions were blunt. Don't get into turning dogfights with German fighters. Don't try to climb with them at low altitude. Exploit your mass. Exploit your power. Exploit your guns. The very attribute that had once looked like a fatal flaw, the P-47's weight, became its secret weapon. In a steep dive, nothing could pursue it. From altitudes around 30 feet, a P-47 could reach around 550 mph, speeds German fighters struggled to approach safely. When the Thunderbolt pulled out of such a dive, its momentum could be turned back into altitude in a zoom climb that left pursuers far behind. Captain Walker Budmahurin helped refine a tactical style that came to be known as boom and zoom. Pilots nicknamed the resulting engagements the Thunderbolt turkey shoot, rather than circling like World War I biplanes. P-47 formations would climb to 30 feet or higher, above the Germans' best operating altitudes. When enemy fighters appeared below, the Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive, reaching such extreme speeds that defensive fire became almost impossible. At the bottom of those dives, when they roared past their prey, the 850s spoke. German survivors described the experience as flying into a solid curtain of metal. The overlapping streams of bullets formed a compact, lethal volume of space rather than a few scattered tracers. Fighters that strayed into that zone didn't just fall, they came apart in midair. The full destructive potential of American firepower became impossible to ignore on August 17, 1943, during the twin raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the deepest U.S. bomber penetration into Germany up to that point. The operation highlighted both sides of the Thunderbolt, its frustrating lack of range, even with external tanks, and its horrifying effectiveness when it could reach the fight. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, encountered a group of Bf-110 destroyers, maneuvering into position to attack B-17s. These twin-engine aircraft, heavily armed with cannons and sometimes rockets, were specialized bomber killers. Schilling and 3 other P-47 pilots rolled into a dive from 28 feet to break up the attack. One of the surviving Bf-110 gunners, Unteroffizier Heinrich Roth, later described the scene during interrogation. The Americans came down like giant hammers. I opened up at about 800 meters. I saw hits on the wing of one fighter, but the P-47 didn't even flinch. Then he fired. The aircraft ahead of us disintegrated. Not merely shot down, obliterated. The wings separated, the tail broke away, the cockpit was torn to pieces. In a couple of seconds, a 110 became nothing at all. In under a minute, 8 Bf-110s were destroyed. German crews had never confronted such concentrated fire. Each Thunderbolt carried 425 rounds per gun, for a total of 400 rounds, nearly 900 pounds of ammunition. With the guns harmonized, their streams met at a point usually around 300 yards out, in a circle about 6 feet across. Anything within that circle at the wrong moment faced more than 100 half-inch slugs each second, each traveling at nearly 30 feet per second. The ammunition itself was another expression of American industrial and technical capacity. German fighters typically carried relatively few cannon shells, often 120 to 200 rounds for each 20mm gun. By contrast, U.S. pilots had enough .50 caliber ammunition for over 30 seconds of sustained fire, and their belts were carefully composed. Armor-piercing incendiary tracer, and ball rounds in a pattern meant to punch through and then set targets ablaze. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gaby Gabreski, who would end the war as the leading American ace in Europe with 28 kills, summed up the effect simply: when all 8 hit at once, the enemy doesn't just go down, he vanishes. I watched a 109 literally split in two, the tail tumbling one way and the front half another. The pilot never had a chance to understand what hit him. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe had discovered a second unpleasant truth. The higher you went, the better the P-47 got, and the worse German fighters performed. The turbo-supercharged double Wasp maintained strong power up to around 30 feet. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, relying on mechanically driven superchargers, saw their performance curve sag sharply beyond about 25 feet. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most successful aces with 206 credited victories, found this out in the most final way on October 8, 1943. Leading Jagdgeschwader won against B-17s at roughly 28 feet near Bremen, he found his Focke-Wulf 190 A6 sluggish and uncooperative in the thin air. The BMW 801 engine, formidable lower down, simply struggled near that height. When Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group dropped on his unit from around 32 feet, the German fighters were sitting ducks. Robert Johnson, by then a seasoned combat pilot, spotted Phillips' distinctively decorated Focke-Wulf from near 31 feet. His combat report was brief, but its meaning was devastating. Opened fire at approximately 300 yards, about 30 degrees deflection. Observed hits along entire length of aircraft. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute. Phillips' death shook the Luftwaffe. If a veteran of more than 500 missions, who had survived both the Eastern and Western fronts, could be cut down so cleanly, what hope did average pilots have? High Command ordered a comprehensive study of the P-47. The report that reached Hermann Göring in November 1943 made for grim reading. The Thunderbolt could reach service ceilings beyond 42 feet, higher than any frontline German fighter. In a dive, its speed approached the transonic zone. Its protection included thick armor around the pilot and engine, plus bullet-resistant glass. Worse, its robust structure allowed it to take punishment that would destroy several lighter fighters combined and still remain controllable. In early 1944, a refined P-47 version began to arrive in Britain and completed the aircraft's transformation from a joke to a nightmare. The P-47-22 introduced a Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller with broad paddle-shaped blades 13 feet across. These blades dug into the air far more efficiently, radically improving the Thunderbolt's rate of climb and acceleration. Earlier P-47s had managed roughly 200 feet per minute at sea level. The paddle blade versions could reach about 30 feet per minute, matching or beating many German fighters at most altitudes. The new prop also changed how the Thunderbolt felt in combat. It picked up speed faster in level flight or a shallow climb, making it easier to build energy quickly and choose when to engage or disengage. Hauptmann Heinz Negus Knock of Jagdgeschwader 11, a veteran of more than 200 sorties, encountered these improved P-47s in February 1944 during a mission near Hanover. In his diary, he wrote, "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We attacked expecting the usual edge. Instead, they turned toward us and came up with us. When we tried to pull away, they followed us above 30 feet. Schmidt was hit and simply blown to pieces. There was nothing left but smoke. These are not the same aircraft we mocked last year." The paddle blade propeller did more than boost performance. It altered the sound of the P-47. At high power, the broad blade's tips edged into the transonic range, creating a deep, rolling roar that carried miles. German troops on the ground learned to identify P-47s by sound alone, a heavy, ominous growl that meant trouble. They nicknamed it Donnerschlag, the thunderclap. By March 1944, Thunderbolts fitted with external tanks were escorting bombers deeper into Germany. Typical long-range loadouts included two 108-gallon wing tanks, or a 75-gallon belly tank, pushing range past 10 miles. With the improved prop, P-47s remained dangerous fighters even immediately after dropping their tanks. The Luftwaffe's tactical answer was to pay as little attention as possible to the escorts and concentrate on the bombers, hoping to bleed the American daylight offensive white. But reaching the bomber stream required flying straight through a thick screen of P-47s, a strategy that increasingly resembled deliberate suicide. As the months passed, German pilots moved from ridicule to a reluctant, almost superstitious respect for the Thunderbolt. Major Günther Röhl, one of Germany's greatest aces with 275 victories, mostly in the East, was badly wounded in an encounter with P-47s on March 6, 1944. In an interview years later, he remembered, "We saw them high above, big dark shapes against the sun. Someone made a joke about flying pigs. 30 seconds later, no one was laughing. They came down like an avalanche. The first attack wiped out 3 of our fighters. Gone, just flaming wreckage. Their guns did not chatter in short bursts like ours. They poured out continuous streams of fire. To be caught in those streams was to die instantly." Those long escort missions revealed yet another Thunderbolt strength: staying power. German fighters, flying at high power settings, burned through fuel quickly. P-47s, with their big radials, could cruise relatively efficiently at altitude. They could stay with bomber formations for hours and still have enough fuel left for prolonged combat and the return trip. As P-51 Mustangs began arriving in significant numbers in the spring of 1944 and took over the longest-range escort duties, P-47 units increasingly shifted toward ground attack missions, a role in which they would become notorious. By April 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of France, the P-47's heavy gun battery was increasingly aimed downward. The same armor-piercing incendiary rounds that shattered fighters also chewed through vehicles, trains, and troops. 2 seconds of fire from a Thunderbolt meant roughly 160 half-inch bullets hitting an area no larger than a truck. When bombs and rockets were added in large numbers, the P-47 evolved into something beyond a traditional fighter bomber. Later P-47 variants could carry a bomb load rivaling that of early war medium bombers, 210-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pound bomb on the centerline, or combinations of bombs and up to 10 5-inch AVAR rockets, each roughly the equivalent of a 105 mm artillery shell. Oberst Hans von Luck, who commanded the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment during Normandy, saw firsthand what Thunderbolt attacks could do. They came in incredibly low, so low we could see their eyes, he recalled. The noise was something out of hell, engines roaring, rockets screaming, then the brutal pounding of their machine guns. A column of our vehicles simply disappeared. 20 trucks turned into a line of burning skeletons in a single attack. The effect on the men's nerves was devastating. We called them jabos, but these were more than fighter bombers. They were flying artillery, but with the accuracy of a sniper. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe learned just how completely air superiority had shifted. More than 500 P-47s covered the Normandy beaches and the surrounding area, forming an almost impenetrable barrier. The handful of German fighters that reached the invasion zone were decimated. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jagdgeschwader II, one of only a tiny number of German pilots who managed to reach the beaches and escape, later said, "The air belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were stacked from the water up to the high altitudes. We tried at dawn with 12 aircraft from our group. I was the only one who returned. The P-47s were there at every level. You could not climb over them or dive under them. Their guns turned our aircraft into falling scraps of metal." In the weeks following D-Day, daytime movement in France became nearly impossible for German forces. The numbers from June 1944 alone are staggering. 9th Air Force P-47s claimed 651 locomotives, 847 trucks, 512 tanks, and other armored vehicles, and 553 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed or damaged. The Wehrmacht was forced to rely on night movement, with all the delays and confusion that entailed. German attempts to counter the Thunderbolt threat ran the gamut: heavier armor, thicker flak belts, more camouflage nets, new dispersal techniques. None of it solved the core problem. The P-47's speed, ruggedness, and firepower made it extremely hard to stop. Even the dreaded 88mm guns found it difficult to hit the fast-moving fighters as they swept low, attacked, and climbed back to safety. While P-47s ravaged German infrastructure, they were also proving to be formidable weapons in the Pacific. The 348th Fighter Group, operating from bases in New Guinea, found the Thunderbolt's attributes: power, range, durability, well suited to the vast distances and harsh conditions of that theater. Colonel Neil Kirby, the 348th commander, developed tactics tuned specifically to Pacific engagements. On October 11, 1943, he led 4 P-47s against approximately 40 Japanese aircraft near Wewak, shooting down 6 himself in a single mission and earning the Medal of Honor. Japanese pilots, accustomed to fighting relatively fragile American fighters, were shocked by the P-47's ability to absorb damage. Ace Saburo Sakai later wrote, "We called them monsters." The same 20mm shells that could destroy a P-40 with a handful of hits seemed useless. I saw one Thunderbolt take many rounds and simply leave. Their return fire was terrifying, solid streams of bullets that tore our aircraft apart. For the Pacific, the P-47 variant was developed with extended wings carrying internal fuel, giving it an enormous effective range of around 350 miles with external tanks. These long-legged Thunderbolts escorted B-29s on missions against Japan, proving that the short-range, high-altitude fighter of 1943 had evolved into a true long-range weapon. The P-47's ultimate vindication came when it faced Germany's most advanced aircraft, the Me-262 jet fighter. On paper, the E-262, capable of about 540 mph in level flight, should have been untouchable for any piston-engined aircraft. In practice, Thunderbolt pilots discovered 2 windows of vulnerability: takeoff and landing, when jets were slow and predictable, and situations where a P-47 could start a dive from superior altitude and convert that height into enormous speed. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the first pilots to shoot down an E-262 while flying a P-47. Starting from about 28,000 feet, he dove his Thunderbolt to speeds near 500 mph and managed to close on the jet in level flight. The German pilot, apparently confident that his speed made him safe, never saw the Thunderbolt coming. At roughly 400 yards, Meyer opened fire. The Me-262 exploded, shedding both engines and large sections of fuselage. In his report, Meyer noted that the concentrated impact of 850 caliber guns proved far more effective against jets than anyone had suspected. By early 1945, the P-47mm was entering combat, an uprated Thunderbolt optimized to tackle jets and V-1 flying bombs. With water methanol injection pushing the double WASP-B's output toward 800 horsepower and aerodynamic tweaks assisting speed, these late-war machines could reach around 470 mph in level flight, near 30 feet, giving them a chance even against jets that were not yet up to full speed. Major George Bostwick, commander of the 63rd Fighter Squadron equipped with P-47Ms, downed 2 Me-262s in March 1945. In his tactical analysis, he emphasized that firepower, not raw speed, was the decisive factor. "The jets are faster," he wrote, "but they turn poorly, and they cannot take hits. One solid burst from our guns, and they disintegrate. They must slow to attack bombers. That is when we pounce." The brute power of American industry revealed itself most starkly during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's New Year's Day offensive of 1945. Nearly 900 German fighters, including some of their last well-trained pilots, launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands, hoping to cripple Allied air power on the ground. At Field Y-34 near Metz, home of the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, the initial surprise worked. German fighters destroyed 22 Thunderbolts on the ground and heavily damaged other aircraft. A captured German pilot, brought into the American command post, pointed triumphantly at the burning wrecks outside. "So," he taunted, "what do you think of that?" Major George Brookings' answer became famous throughout the 9th Air Force. Gesturing toward the flight line where mechanics and ground crews were already clearing wreckage and preparing stands, he replied, "By tomorrow, we'll have 40 brand new ones parked out there. How long will it take you to replace the men who just died?" The German's expression hardened. The joke was over. Within 2 days, fresh P-47-40s flown in from depots in England were parked where the destroyed aircraft had been. The Luftwaffe, in contrast, had lost 271 fighters and 213 pilots in Bodenplatte, including many of its irreplaceable instructors and leaders. Those losses were permanent. Across all attacked fields, the Allies lost 134 aircraft total and made good the losses within about a week. The numbers behind the P-47 program illustrate the scale of American industry. Republic built 15,683 Thunderbolts during the war, more than any other U.S. fighter type. At peak output, the Farmingdale plant on Long Island completed a finished P-47 about every hour. The Evansville factory in Indiana, built from scratch on farmland in 1942, was turning out around 500 Thunderbolts a month by 1944. Each P-47 contained roughly 65 zero parts, some 8 miles of wiring, around a ton of aluminum, and hundreds of pounds of rubber. The R-2800 engine alone included roughly 400 carefully machined components, many built to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Yet the American workforce, often including women who'd never even seen an airplane up close before Pearl Harbor, assembled these machines with a level of quality that often exceeded pre-war, peacetime standards. Supporting all those aircraft required equally massive ammunition and fuel production. Every P-47 mission consumed 300-400 rounds of 50 caliber ammo throughout. With hundreds of Thunderbolts flying daily, ammunition expenditure climbed into the tens of millions of rounds per month. The Lake City Arsenal in Missouri, just one of several plants feeding the demand, produced around 30 million 50 caliber cartridges monthly. Each round had to be dimensionally perfect to ensure flawless feeding at extreme rates of fire and under brutal maneuvering. Fuel use was equally breathtaking. A Thunderbolt might burn roughly 100 gallons per hour in cruise and up to 300 gallons per hour in combat with water injection engaged. By late 1944, the 9th Air Force alone was chewing through over 25 million gallons of aviation fuel each month, shipped across the Atlantic in tankers mass-produced in American shipyards. Pilot training scaled up in step. By 1944, U.S. advanced flying schools were producing around 30 new pilots per year, more than Germany managed across the entire conflict. Each Thunderbolt pilot usually had a minimum of 400 flight hours before his first combat sortie, including roughly 100 hours in advanced or high-performance aircraft. As the war dragged on, many German pilots were sent into front-line units with fewer than 100 hours in total. The difference was obvious in combat. American pilots arrived already drilled in formation flying, instrument work, navigation, deflection shooting, and tactical coordination. They had watched gun camera footage from real engagements, studied detailed technical manuals, and in some cases flown training sorties against captured German aircraft to learn their opponent's strengths and weaknesses. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, who reached England in September 1944, described his position bluntly. "I had 420 hours logged, with about 75 of those in the P-47. I'd practiced on towed targets, trained deflection shots, and pored over film taken from our own guns. On my first mission, I knew what to expect. The German I tangled with probably had less than half my time. It wasn't a fair contest. In March 1945, Oberstleutnant Josef Priller, the same man who had once described P-47s as pregnant cows, was interviewed by propaganda officials looking for inspirational comments. His actual statement was considered too demoralizing to publish, but it survives in records and shows how far opinions had swung. "The Thunderbolt is the finest fighter bomber ever built," he said. "Its firepower is beyond anything previously imagined. The guns don't jam easily, they don't overheat, and in a normal fight, they rarely run out. It carries bombs like a small bomber, fires rockets like artillery, and when necessary, it can engage as a proper fighter. But the machine is only part of the story. It symbolizes American industry. They lose 10 and produce 20 more. We lose one, and it is gone forever. Their pilots arrive trained better than many of our instructors. They have endless fuel for practice, ammunition for training, spare parts for everything. We have courage, but courage without resources is only a way of postponing defeat. We laughed at them in 1943. No one laughs now. When you hear those guns start, you know death is in the sky. The sound stays with you. Mechanical, methodical, unstoppable. Like America itself, it is about overwhelming material force. We were not beaten by superior tactics or braver men. We were buried under steel and bullets. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe remained mostly on paper. Fuel shortages kept many aircraft on the ground. Experienced pilots were dead, missing, or prisoners. Runways and hangars had been bombed to rubble. And even if Germany had possessed more planes and fuel, the tactical reality remained. Reaching Allied bombers or ground forces meant flying through layers of P-47s that dominated the air from treetop level to 40,000 feet. Feldwebel Klaus Brettschneider, among the last German fighter pilots to complete training in 1945, managed exactly one combat mission near Leipzig before the war ended. His meeting with P-47s lasted scarcely more than a dozen seconds. "I saw 4 Thunderbolts dropping from above, flying in perfect formation," he recalled. "I tried to turn, but they were already too fast." The leader fired from about 500 meters. "My aircraft felt as if giant hammers were pounding the fuselage. The engine erupted. A wing tore away. I barely escaped with my life. Hanging in my parachute, I watched them destroy my entire staffel. 6 fighters gone in less than a minute. The sky was full of burning metal and bodies." By that point, the psychological impact was complete. German medical officers wrote about Jabo panic, physical symptoms of stress triggered by the mere threat of fighter-bomber attack. Pilots who had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without flinching began to experience shaking hands, nausea, and sleeplessness before missions into areas patrolled by Thunderbolts. On the ground, the rumble of P-47 engines sent troops rushing for cover, knowing that to hesitate was to risk being shredded by bombs, rockets, or machine guns. The final scorecard of P-47 operations borders on the unbelievable. In Europe, Thunderbolts were credited with destroying 752 German aircraft in aerial combat and another 315 on the ground. They wrecked roughly 86 railroad cars, 90 locomotives, 60 armored fighting vehicles, 68 trucks, and 60 horse-drawn vehicles. In the Pacific Theater, P-47s were credited with 697 Japanese aircraft shot down in the air, 150 destroyed on the ground, around 1,500 vehicles, 150 locomotives, plus an uncounted number of rivercraft, barges, and fixed installations. The 9th Air Force alone, largely equipped with Thunderbolts, flew 213 873 combat sorties, dropped about 120 tons of bombs, fired roughly 135 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, and launched approximately 60 rockets. P-47 units in Europe recorded something like a 4:6 kill ratio in air-to-air combat while suffering the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter-bomber force. Behind those cold numbers lay a human tragedy for the Luftwaffe. Roughly 28 of its pilots were killed in combat against Western Allied forces. A huge portion of them died in the hail of fire from American heavy machine guns. Each loss represented years of training, experience, and skill that could no longer be replaced. By the final months of the war, the average German fighter pilot had fewer than 30 hours of actual combat time. The average P-47 pilot had more than 200. At the Luftwaffe's interrogation center at Oberursel, captured Allied pilots were questioned by German intelligence. After the war, Allied investigators examined the German internal assessments of Allied aircraft. The file on the P-47, updated step by step throughout the conflict, reads like a timeline of humiliation. In April 1943, the entry described the Thunderbolt as large, unwieldy, and inferior to German fighters in all performance categories except diving speed. Machine gun armament inadequate against cannon-equipped fighters. Overall threat minimal. By December 1943, the tone had shifted. Outstanding high-altitude performance. Extraordinary structural strength. Firepower increasingly problematic. Pilot tactics noticeably improving. Overall threat significant, above 25 feet. In June 1944, the verdict hardened. Dominant fighter bomber, superior to all German types above 20 feet. Firepower devastating against aircraft, armored vehicles, and soft targets. Structural durability makes destruction extremely difficult. Overall threat critical at all altitudes. By March 1945, the final assessment read simply, best fighter bomber currently in service with the enemy. Unique combination of firepower, survivability, and performance. Pilot training noticeably superior. Overall assessment, direct engagement not survivable. 4 decades later, in 1985, former German and American pilots gathered in Phoenix, Arizona, meeting as old men rather than mortal enemies. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, who had once commanded the Luftwaffe's entire fighter force, was asked about the P-47. His reply, captured on video, summed up the whole story in a few sentences. In 1943, we made a very serious error, he admitted. We saw this big, heavy fighter, and we mocked it. The Americans do not understand fighter design, we said. They built a bomber and call it a fighter. It was we who did not understand. The Americans never tried to build a European-style fighter. They built something American, designed to be produced in thousands, to hit very hard, and to bring its pilot home. They understood that in a long war, the aircraft that could endure punishment and deliver overwhelming firepower would decide the outcome. They were correct. The first time I flew a captured P-47 after the war, I finally saw it through their eyes. The engine felt almost limitless. It seemed to climb as though pulled upward. The cockpit was roomy and comfortable, with excellent visibility. The controls were crisp. It was a pilot's airplane wrapped in steel. But what impressed me most was realizing that the United States had built over 15 of these complicated machines while fighting on 2 major fronts. Each one needed an engine more difficult to manufacture than anything we produced. Yet, they built them more quickly than we built much simpler fighters. At that moment, I knew we never truly had a chance. We used to call their guns Roosevelt's piano because of the noise when they fired. That sound stays with you. Many of my friends heard it only once. The P-47 did more than defeat the Luftwaffe. It dismantled it. The Thunderbolt's design was a pure expression of American engineering philosophy. Heavy, powerful, robust, and backed by almost inexhaustible resources. Every major component was overbuilt. The main wing spars could bear about 40 pounds, roughly triple the airplane's loaded weight. The engine mount was strong enough to handle up to 12 GE. Control cables ran in duplicate with automatic backups. Even the gun system was an engineering triumph. 8 ammunition boxes, each holding 425 rounds, fed the Browning guns through electrically driven booster mechanisms to prevent stoppages in hard maneuvers. The guns themselves were electrically heated to prevent freezing at high altitude. Each gun could be charged and tested independently. Pilots could have their guns harmonized anywhere from 150 to 400 yards, adjusting the convergence pattern to match their preferred shooting range. Some German veterans, even after the war, tried to console themselves with the idea that the P-47 had won purely by numbers, that German fighters were technically superior but crushed by mass production. The hard data from actual engagements doesn't support that comforting story. In fights where numbers were roughly equal, Thunderbolts very often came out on top. The heavy machine gun armament, sneered at as inferior to cannons, proved more lethal in real-world conditions. Analysis of gun camera film revealed why. A 20 mm cannon shell carried more destructive energy per hit, but German fighters carried relatively few rounds and needed precise aim with short bursts to make them count. A typical Bf-109 or FW-190 might have 120, 200 rounds of 20 ammunition. The P-47, by contrast, poured out a dense cloud of 50 caliber bullets. At combat ranges, a 2-second burst often put 20 or more rounds into a fighter-sized target, more than enough to guarantee destruction. American 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary ammunition also featured clever delayed fuse designs. Instead of detonating on impact, the round penetrated, then exploded or burned inside the structure. The incendiary mix burned at roughly 30 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite aluminum and fuel. German 20 mm shells, though individually more powerful, often burst on the surface, creating impressive flashes that sometimes produced only superficial damage. The P-47 Thunderbolt retains its distinction as the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced. Its empty weight was around 10 pounds, more than the fully loaded weight of some twin-engine aircraft from the previous war. Its engine produced more power than entire World War I bomber flights. Its guns delivered more firepower than an infantry squad. And yet it was flown by teenagers and young men in their early 20s, maintained in muddy improvised airstrips by mechanics who had learned their trade in a matter of months. In less than 2 years, German views of the Thunderbolt traveled from ridicule to dread. During that brief span, the flying milk bottle became one of the most feared aircraft the Luftwaffe ever encountered. Pilots who had faced Hurricanes, Spitfires, and Soviet Yaks without flinching spoke about the P-47 in hushed tones for the rest of their lives. Today, at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47 stands among other legendary fighters. Its information plaque lists performance numbers, unit assignments, and awards. But the real story is told in a nearby glass case. Inside lies a strip of gun camera film showing a Focke-Wulf 190 breaking apart under fire, and a handful of battered 50 caliber shell casings. Below it, a translated line from a 1945 German interrogation report is mounted. "We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters that could not turn, could not climb, could not fight. We stopped laughing when we realized they did not need to turn or climb. They only needed to point their guns at you, and you were no longer there. The laughter died with our comrades." The P-47 entered combat as a target of mockery and ended the war as an instrument of extermination. In the space between those 2 points, 8 synchronized Browning machine guns redefined aerial warfare and buried the Luftwaffe beneath a storm of lead. In April 1943, German pilots laughed at the clumsy American fighter. By May 1945, there were almost no German pilots left to laugh at anything. The thunder had spoken, and the sky belonged to the United States.